The rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, turning the streets of Chicago's South Side into rivers of reflected neon and old memories. Grace Miller watched the water streak down the diner's front window, distorting the world outside into something unrecognizable, which felt appropriate somehow for the kind of day it had been. Her feet ached, the kind of deep bone-tired ache that came from 10 hours on worn linoleum floors, carrying plates that seemed to get heavier with each passing year. She was only 25, but some days like this, she felt ancient. "Grace, honey, table 7 needs a refill," called out Marge from behind the counter. Marge had owned Lou's Diner for 30 years, and her voice carried the same warm rasp as the coffee she served, comforting and slightly bitter all at once. "On it," Grace replied, grabbing the coffee pot and forcing her tired legs to move. Table 7 was occupied by Mr. Chen, a regular who'd been coming in every Thursday for as long as Grace had worked there. He nodded gratefully as she poured, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. "Cold one tonight," he observed. "November in Chicago," Grace said with a small smile. "Should be illegal to be this cold before Thanksgiving." Mr. Chen chuckled, and Grace moved on to the next table, then the next. The evening dinner rush had finally died down, leaving only the regulars and the stragglers, people like her, she supposed, who had nowhere better to be. The diner itself was nothing special. Red vinyl booths that had been patched more times than anyone could count, a checkerboard floor that had lost its shine decades ago, and walls decorated with old photographs of a Chicago that existed only in memory now. But it was clean, the coffee was hot, and Marge didn't ask questions when Grace picked up extra shifts. She needed those extra shifts, desperately. Grace's mind wandered to her younger brother Tyler, as it always did during the quiet moments. 22 years old and fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. The hospital bills were mounting faster than she could count, and her small apartment felt emptier every day he spent in that sterile room, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed their mechanical lullabies. "You okay, sweetheart?" Marge's voice cut through her thoughts. Grace blinked, realizing she'd been standing still, staring at nothing. "Yeah, just tired." Marge's knowing eyes said she didn't believe it, but she nodded anyway. "Why don't you take your break? I can handle the floor for 15 minutes. "I'm fine, really." The door opened. The bell above it chimed, that same tinny sound it had made 1,000 times that day. But something changed. Grace felt it immediately, the way you feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain falls. The ambient noise of the diner, silverware clinking, the low murmur of conversation, the hiss of the grill, all of it seemed to fade into background static. The man who entered was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair that was just beginning to show gray at the temples. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that didn't belong in this neighborhood, perfectly tailored to broad shoulders that suggested he hadn't always made his living behind a desk. His shoes were Italian leather, unmarred by the rain outside, and when he moved, it was with the kind of controlled grace that came from absolute confidence, or absolute danger. Grace watched as every person in the diner became suddenly very interested in their food. Mr. Chen stared into his coffee. The couple in booth 3 stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Even Tommy, the line cook, found something fascinating about the grill that required his complete attention. The man's eyes swept the room with a practiced efficiency, noting exits, counting people, calculating risks, before landing on an empty booth in the corner. Grace's section, naturally. "I'll get him," Grace said quietly to Marge. "Grace?" Marge started, her voice carrying a warning. "It's fine," Grace interrupted, straightening her apron. "He's just a customer." But they both knew that wasn't true. Grace grabbed a menu and approached the booth, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Up close, the man was even more striking. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, and eyes that were an unsettling shade of gray. Like storm clouds, she thought, like the sky before something terrible happens. "Good evening," she said, keeping her voice steady as she placed the menu in front of him. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt the full weight of that attention. It wasn't lecherous or threatening in the obvious way. It was assessing, like he was reading a book, written in a language only he understood. "Coffee," he said. His voice was deep, cultured, with the faintest hint of a New York accent that had been smoothed over by years of something else. "Black. I'll be right back with that." As Grace walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was present, a weight she couldn't shake. She poured the coffee with hands that were almost steady and returned to the booth. "Have you decided on food, or do you need a few more minutes?" she asked. "The ribeye," he said without looking at the menu. "Medium rare, whatever vegetables you have today. And bring me a proper steak knife, please. The one here is—" He glanced at the standard diner cutlery. "Inadequate." Grace nodded and headed to the kitchen. She put in the order, then rummaged through the drawer where Marge kept the better silverware, the pieces reserved for the rare occasions when someone ordered something that actually required them. Her hand closed around a proper steak knife, and then she paused. Next to the silverware drawer was another, a junk drawer really, filled with rubber bands, old receipts, and promotional items from various suppliers, and there in the back was a small spool of red ribbon left over from last Christmas. Grace didn't know what made her do it. Instinct, maybe. Or perhaps it was the way everyone in the diner had reacted when he walked in. The sudden silence, the averted eyes, the palpable fear disguised as indifference. She pulled a length of ribbon from the spool, cut it with kitchen scissors, and carefully tied it around the handle of the steak knife. A neat bow, like a gift, or a warning. In some cultures, red meant celebration. In others it meant danger. Grace wasn't sure which message she was sending, maybe both. But as she carried the wrapped knife back to the dining room along with his water and silverware, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. "Your steak will be about 15 minutes, she said, setting everything down in front of him. The man's eyes dropped to the knife, to the red ribbon tied carefully around its handle. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at that splash of crimson against the steel. Then slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a large smile, barely a curve at the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his entire face. Suddenly he looked younger, less dangerous, almost human. "Interesting," he said softly, picking up the knife and examining the ribbon. "A warning?" Grace met his eyes directly. "An observation? And what exactly are you observing, Miss Miller?" Grace Miller. She didn't know why she gave him her full name. "And I'm observing that you're not from around here, that people are nervous, and that maybe you should know that this is a quiet place. A safe place. People come here to eat, to rest, to escape whatever's waiting for them outside." The man set the knife down carefully, the ribbon still in place. "And you're afraid I might disturb that peace. I'm saying I'd prefer if you didn't." Another pause. Then, "Adrian Cole." He offered his hand across the table. Grace hesitated only a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, warm and brief. "I appreciate the warning, Miss Miller," Adrian said, and there was something in his voice. Respect, maybe, or surprise. "You have my word that no trouble will follow me through that door." "Not tonight." "Not tonight?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "I try not to make promises I can't keep." It was an honest answer, at least. Grace nodded and went to check on her other tables, but her mind remained firmly on the man in the corner booth. Adrian Cole. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he carried himself, the reactions he provoked, those meant everything. When his steak came up, Grace delivered it personally. Adrian looked at the plate, then at her. "You tied the ribbon," he observed. "Not your cook, not your manager. You. Is that a problem?" "On the contrary." He picked up the knife, red ribbon still in place, and cut into the meat with practiced precision. "It shows character, courage. Most people would have sent someone else to deliver it." "Maybe I'm not most people." "No," Adrian agreed, taking a bite. "I don't think you are." They fell into silence then. Grace attended to her other tables. Mr. Chen left, replaced by a young couple sharing a milkshake. The stragglers thinned out as the night deepened, but she found her attention drawn back to Adrian Cole again and again. He ate methodically, never hurried, but with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted. He drank his coffee black and hot, and twice she refilled it without him having to ask. He said, "Thank you," both times, and somehow that simple courtesy felt significant. Around 9:30, Marge started her closing procedures. The young couple left. The kitchen grew quiet. And still, Adrian Cole sat in his booth, a half-empty coffee cup in front of him, staring out at the rain-soaked streets. Grace approached with the check. "We close at 10, she said gently. "Of course." He took the check, glanced at it, a $30 meal, and pulled out his wallet. But instead of two 20s, he placed $500 bills on the table. Grace stared at the money. "Sir, that's—" "The meal was excellent," Adrian interrupted, "and the company was—" Unexpected. Please accept it. I can't. Miss Miller. His voice was firm but not unkind. I suspect you have reasons for working double shifts in a diner in this neighborhood. I suspect those reasons are important. Take the money. Call it payment for the warning. Grace's throat tightened. The money would cover 2 months of Tyler's medication. It would keep the electricity on. It would let her sleep without that constant knot of anxiety in her stomach, at least for a little while. But accepting money from a man like this, because she knew now with absolute certainty what kind of man Adrian Cole was, felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Please, Adrian said, and there was something raw in that single word, something almost human. Let me do one good thing today. Grace picked up the money with trembling fingers. Thank you. No. Adrian stood, adjusting his jacket. Thank you. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Without turning around, he spoke again. The red ribbon. In some places, it's used to mark things that are off limits. Forbidden territory. Sacred ground. He glanced back over his shoulder, and in the dim light of the diner, his eyes looked almost sad. You chose well, Miss Miller. Then he was gone, the bell chiming once more as the door closed behind him. Grace stood there, $500 in her hand and a strange hollowness in her chest. Marge appeared beside her, unusually quiet. You know who that was? Marge asked. I know what he was. And you gave him a warning anyway, with a red ribbon on his knife. Marge shook her head, but there was something like pride in her expression. You've got steel in you, girl. I always knew it, but tonight you proved it. Grace looked down at the money in her hands. He left this. Then use it for whatever you need it for. Men like that don't leave money expecting anything back. They leave it because they can, and because maybe, just maybe, doing one small good thing makes them feel less like what they really are. That night, after the diner closed and Grace walked the 6 blocks to her apartment through streets still wet with rain, she thought about Adrian Cole, about the way he'd smiled at the red ribbon, about the sadness in his eyes when he'd said, "Let me do one good thing today." She thought about the money in her purse, money that would ease her burdens but came from a source she couldn't quite reconcile with her conscience. Most of all, she thought about his final words. You chose well, Miss Miller. Had she? She'd warned him, yes, marked him as dangerous, as someone who didn't belong in her world, but he'd taken that warning with grace and something that looked almost like gratitude. In her small apartment, Grace pulled out the hospital bills that were stacked on her kitchen table. She counted out what she needed, what Tyler needed, and carefully tucked the money into an envelope. Tomorrow she would make payments. Tomorrow she would breathe a little easier. But tonight she stood at her window and looked out at Chicago, at the city that held so many secrets in its steel and stone, and wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if somehow that red ribbon had done exactly what it needed to do. In the distance, thunder rumbled. The storm wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the red ribbon, and Chicago had transformed from autumn rain into the brutal honesty of early winter. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through the streets like a blade made of ice, and the sky hung low and gray, promising snow that hadn't yet arrived. Grace stood at the window of Tyler's hospital room, watching the city prepare for the season. Behind her, the steady beep of monitors provided a rhythm to the silence, a sound she'd grown to both hate and depend on. It meant he was still here, still fighting. You don't have to stay, Tyler said from the bed, his voice thin but a tempting lightness. I'm just going to sleep anyway. These medications make me tired. Grace turned to look at her brother. At 22, he should have been finishing college, chasing dreams, falling in love. Instead, he was pale and drawn, tethered to machines that tracked every heartbeat, every breath. His dark hair, the same shade as hers, had grown longer in the past months, and he'd started wearing it pulled back because he was too tired to deal with it falling in his eyes. I like being here, Grace said, moving to sit in the chair beside his bed. It wasn't entirely true. She hated seeing him like this, but the alternative, leaving him alone in this sterile room, felt worse. Liar. But Tyler smiled, and for a moment he looked like himself again. You've been working double shifts. Marge told me when she visited yesterday. Marge has a big mouth. Marge cares about you, so do I. Tyler reached out and took her hand. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but his eyes were fierce. I don't want you burning yourself out for me, Grace. Where else would I rather be? Grace squeezed his hand gently. Besides, I've got this. The bills are covered for this month. Maybe next month, too. She didn't mention the $500. Didn't mention Adrian Cole. Some things were too complicated to explain, even to Tyler. They talked for another hour, about nothing and everything. Tyler told her about the book he was reading, a science fiction novel about people colonizing Mars. Grace told him about the diner, about Mr. Chen's terrible jokes about how Marge was threatening to update the menu for the first time in a decade. She didn't tell him that she kept looking at the door every time the bell chimed, that she'd been doing that for 2 weeks straight. That part of her was relieved Adrian Cole hadn't returned, while another part, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, was almost disappointed. When visiting hours ended, Grace kissed Tyler's forehead and promised to come back tomorrow. She took the bus back to the south side, the windows fogged with the breath of tired passengers, everyone hunched into their coats against the cold. By the time she reached the diner for her evening shift, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. "Finally," Marge said when Grace walked through the door. "Been waiting all year for this. Nothing like the first snow." Grace tied on her apron and grabbed her order pad. The dinner rush was just beginning. Families seeking comfort food against the cold, workers stopping in before heading home. She fell into the familiar rhythm, taking orders, delivering food, refilling coffee cups, smiling even when her feet ached and her mind wandered. She was halfway through her shift when the bell above the door chimed, and she knew, before she even looked up, who it was. Adrian Cole stood in the doorway, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of his dark wool coat. His eyes found hers immediately, and he nodded once before moving to the same corner booth he'd occupied 2 weeks ago. Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest, a stutter step that she absolutely did not want to analyze. "I've got him," she told Marge, who was already reaching for a menu. "Of course you do," Marge muttered, but there was no judgment in her voice, just that knowing look that older women get when they see something younger women haven't figured out yet. Grace approached the booth with her order pad in hand, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "Mr. Cole, Miss Miller." He smiled, that same small smile from before, like he was in on a joke only he understood. "Coffee, please." "Black. Just coffee?" "For now. I find myself craving the atmosphere more than the food tonight." Grace poured his coffee and left him to it, but she felt his presence in the diner like a magnetic pull. Every time she passed his booth, his eyes tracked her movement. Not in a way that felt invasive, but attentive, like she was the most interesting thing in the room. It was unnerving, and if she was honest with herself, a little thrilling. An hour later, the dinner rush had mellowed into the evening lull. Grace was wiping down table 3 when Adrian spoke from his booth. "How's your brother?" Grace froze, the cloth still in her hand. She turned slowly. "Excuse me? Your brother, Tyler, I believe. 22 years old, patient at Northwestern Memorial." Adrian's voice was conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "I'm asking how he is." The blood drained from Grace's face. "How do you know about Tyler?" "I make it my business to know things." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Please sit. You look like you're about to either run or throw that coffee pot at my head, and I'd prefer neither." Grace glanced at Marge, who nodded slightly. Permission, or maybe just acceptance of the inevitable. She slid into the booth across from Adrian, her hands clenched in her lap. "You investigated me," she said flatly. "I did basic research. There's a difference." Adrian leaned back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "You're Grace Elizabeth Miller, 25 years old. You work 2 jobs, this diner and weekend shifts at a bookstore in Lincoln Park. You've been supporting your brother for the past 18 months since your parents passed in a car accident. No debt beyond medical bills, no criminal record, no social media presence worth mentioning. You're remarkably invisible for someone so present." Grace felt violation and fear warring in her chest. "That's incredibly inappropriate." "Yes," Adrian agreed simply. "It is. But I don't operate in a world where appropriate matters much." He leaned forward slightly. "I came back because I wanted to know who would have the courage to tie a red ribbon on a stranger's knife. What I found was someone doing everything right for the right reasons and still losing. That interested me. I don't need your interest. Perhaps not, but you do need help." "I don't need your help either," Grace said sharply. "I've got everything under control. Do you?" Adrian pulled out his phone and scrolled through something before turning it to face her. It was a scan of a hospital bill, Tyler's hospital bill, one she just received that morning, one that made her stomach drop every time she looked at the numbers. "How did you—" Grace started, then stopped. Of course he had access to that information. Men like Adrian Cole had access to everything. Your insurance company denied the latest treatment request, Adrian said quietly. The appeal process will take months. Months your brother may not have. The alternative is paying out of pocket, approximately $75,000. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. That's none of your business. You're right. It's not. Adrian put his phone away. But I'm making it my business anyway. Why? The word came out sharp, almost angry. Why do you care? You don't know me. You don't know Tyler. We're nothing to you. Because 2 weeks ago, you saw exactly what I was, and instead of cowering or calling the authorities or pretending I didn't exist, you tied a red ribbon on my knife and looked me in the eye. Adrian's voice was intense now, stripped of its usual control. Do you know how rare that is? Real courage? Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it? That wasn't courage. That was stupidity. No, Adrian shook his head. Stupidity is reckless. What you did was calculated. You drew a line and dared me to cross it. And when I respected that line, you gave me something I haven't experienced in a very long time. What's that? The benefit of the doubt. They sat in silence for a moment, the diner humming with life around them. The clink of silverware, the hiss of the grill, the murmur of conversation. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Sounds that felt very far away from the conversation happening in this booth. I can't take your money, Grace said finally. I won't be indebted to someone like you. Something flickered across Adrian's face. Hurt, maybe, or resignation. Someone like me. You know what I mean. I do. He stood, pulling out his wallet and leaving cash for the coffee he'd barely touched. I respect your boundaries, Miss Miller. I won't push. But the offer stands, no strings attached. Think about it. Think about Tyler. He was almost to the door when Grace called out, Why do you keep coming back here? Adrian paused, his hand on the door handle. When he turned, the vulnerability in his expression made him look younger, less dangerous, almost lonely. Because you're the only person who's ever warned me instead of feared me, he said simply. And I find I quite like being warned. Then he was gone, disappearing into the snowy Chicago night. Grace sat in the empty booth for a long time after, her mind spinning. Marge eventually slid into the seat Adrian had vacated. That man's trouble, Marge said. I know, but not the kind of trouble you expect. Grace looked up at her boss, her friend, her surrogate mother in many ways. What do you mean? I mean, I've seen a lot of people in my 30 years running this place. I've seen men who use their power to take, and I've seen men who have power and don't know what to do with it except try to give it away. Marge patted Grace's hand. That one? He's the second kind, which somehow makes him more dangerous than the first. Why? Because men like that make you want to believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that people can change. Marge's eyes were sad. And sometimes they can, but sometimes they can't. And you won't know which one he is until it's too late. Grace went home that night with Marge's words echoing in her head. She checked her bank account, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, let alone the mountain of medical bills waiting. She looked at the hospital's letter, the one denying Tyler's treatment, and felt helplessness wash over her like a wave. She pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time before finally typing Adrian Cole's name into the search bar. The results were illuminating and terrifying. Adrian Michael Cole, 38 years old, prominent Chicago businessman according to the legitimate news sources, owner of several nightclubs, restaurants, and commercial properties, appeared frequently at charity events, always in expensive suits, always alone. But the other sources, the ones you had to dig for, told a different story. Whispers of connections to organized operations, speculation about how he'd acquired his wealth so young, references to a family business that no one discussed in polite company. There were no charges, no convictions, nothing concrete, but the implication was clear. Adrian Cole was exactly what she'd thought he was, what everyone in the diner had known the moment he walked through the door. And yet, Grace found herself scrolling through photos of him at a charity gala for children's hospitals, at a fundraiser for literacy programs, at the opening of a community center in a neighborhood that desperately needed one. In every photo he looked composed, controlled, giving nothing away, but there was something in his eyes, that same sadness she'd seen in the diner, like a man serving a sentence he'd given himself. Grace closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would go see Tyler. Tomorrow she would smile and pretend everything was fine. Tomorrow she would work another double shift and come home to bills she couldn't pay, and a future that felt increasingly impossible. But tonight she let herself wonder, just for a moment, what it would be like to say yes. To accept help from someone who terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. To let someone else carry the weight she'd been bearing alone. It was a dangerous thought. Marge was right. Men like Adrian Cole made you believe in possibilities that didn't exist. But God, she was tired of being strong all by herself. The second week began much like the first. Adrian came to the diner every evening, always sitting in the same booth, always ordering coffee and sometimes food. They didn't speak much. Grace was careful to maintain professional distance, but the silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. On Tuesday, Adrian left a book on the table when he departed. Grace found it after he'd gone. A first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo. Inside the cover, a note in elegant handwriting. Sometimes the greatest prison is the one we build ourselves. AC. On Wednesday, Tyler's doctor called with bad news about test results. Grace stood in the hospital corridor, phone pressed to her ear, and felt the walls closing in. When she returned to the diner that evening, Adrian took one look at her face and asked no questions. He simply sat in his booth, a quiet presence, until her shift ended. On Thursday, two men entered the diner just before closing. Grace recognized trouble the moment they walked in. It was in their swagger, in the way they scanned the room with predatory eyes, in the tension that suddenly filled the space like smoke. They were younger than Adrian, maybe late 20s, wearing designer streetwear that screamed money and danger. One of them, tall, with a scar running down his left cheek, locked eyes with Adrian in the corner booth. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. "Adrian Cole, long way from your usual territory." Grace felt her blood turn to ice. The few remaining customers suddenly found reasons to leave, grabbing their coats and hurrying out into the night. Marge disappeared into the kitchen and Grace heard her on the phone, hopefully calling for help. Adrian remained seated, his posture relaxed, but Grace saw the change in his eyes. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Marcus," Adrian said evenly, "I'm having coffee. I'd prefer not to be disturbed." "I'm sure you would." Marcus approached the booth, his companion hanging back near the door. "Word is you've been spending a lot of time in this neighborhood." "My neighborhood? That seems, disrespectful. I'm patronizing a business. There's no disrespect intended, isn't there?" Marcus's eyes flicked to Grace, who stood frozen behind the counter. "Or maybe you found something here worth the trip. Something pretty." Grace felt the threat in those words, felt the situation spiraling toward something she couldn't control, and she realized, in that moment, that she had a choice. She could hide in the kitchen, let this play out however it was going to play out. Or she could do what she'd done 2 weeks ago, draw a line and dare someone to cross it. She grabbed the coffee pot and walked toward the booth. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice remarkably steady, "we close in 10 minutes, so if you're not ordering, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Marcus stared at her like she'd sprouted a second head. "You've got to be kidding me." "Health code," Grace continued, channeling every ounce of false confidence she possessed. "Can't have unauthorized people in the establishment during closing procedures. It's the law." "The law," Marcus repeated, then laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Did you hear that, Adrian? Your little waitress is worried about the law." "She has a point," Adrian said quietly, standing now. He moved to place himself between Marcus and Grace, a subtle repositioning that put his body as a barrier. "And you're making her uncomfortable. I think it's time for you to go." "You think—" Marcus started, his hand moving toward his jacket. "Marcus," Adrian's voice cut like steel, "look at me. Really look at me. Do you want to do this? Here? Now? Over nothing?" For a long moment, the air in the diner felt thin, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. Grace watched the two men stare at each other, engaged in some silent negotiation that she couldn't begin to understand. Finally, Marcus stepped back. "This isn't over, Cole." "It is for tonight," Adrian replied. Marcus and his companion left, the bell chiming cheerfully behind them, a sound absurdly at odds with what had just happened. The moment the door closed, Grace felt her knees go weak. She gripped the counter for support. Adrian turned to her, concern replacing the coldness in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "What was that?" Grace demanded, anger replacing fear. "What was that? You said no trouble would follow you here." "I said not that night. I couldn't promise more than that." "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Grace slammed the coffee pot down harder than she intended. "This is why I tied that ribbon. To keep this," she gestured wildly, "this world out of here. You're right. Adrian's shoulders sagged slightly. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry. Sorry? Those men won't be back. I'll make sure of it. How? Grace challenged. How will you make sure? What are you going to do? Nothing that should concern you. Everything about this concerns me. This is my workplace. My safe place. You brought danger here. I know. Adrian pulled out his wallet and placed several bills on the counter, far more than he owed. I'll stay away, I promise. You won't see me again. He walked toward the door and Grace felt panic rise in her throat. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? For him to leave, to take his complicated world and dangerous connections far away from her simple life. But watching him go, she remembered what Marge had said, about men who had power and didn't know what to do with it except give it away, about believing in redemption, about not knowing which kind of man he was until it was too late. Wait, she called out. Adrian paused, his hand on the door. The ribbon was a warning, Grace said, her voice softer now. But you stepped between me and that man. You protected me. You didn't have to do that. Yes, Adrian said without turning around. I did. Why? Now he looked back, and the expression on his face was so raw, so genuine, that it took her breath away. Because some things are worth protecting, even if you have no right to protect them. They stood there separated by the length of the diner, connected by something neither of them could name. The ribbon was a warning, Grace repeated. And you heard it. You respected it. Even tonight, you could have handled that differently, more violently. But you didn't. Not here. Not in front of me. Does that matter? Yes, Grace admitted. It matters. Adrian moved back toward the booth and placed something on the table, a business card with a phone number. If you need anything, if those men come back, if Tyler needs help, anything at all. Grace picked up the card, running her thumb over the embossed numbers. This doesn't mean... I know, Adrian interrupted gently. It doesn't mean anything except that I'm available if you need me. No expectations, no obligations, just a number, in case of emergency. Thank you, Grace whispered. No, Adrian smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Thank you, Miss Miller. The ribbon was a warning. Tonight you protected me right back. Now we're even. He left then, disappearing into the Chicago night, where the snow fell soft and quiet, covering the city's sins under a blanket of white. Grace stood in the empty diner, holding the card, and wondered what it meant that she was relieved he'd given it to her. Marge emerged from the kitchen. You okay, honey? I don't know, Grace admitted. Am I crazy, Marge? For not being more afraid? Maybe. Or maybe you see something in him that even he doesn't see in himself. Marge began closing up the register. Just be careful, Grace. Lines are easy to draw, but once you cross them, you can't uncross them. That night, Grace lay in bed and stared at Adrian's business card. She thought about Tyler, about impossible bills and denied treatments. She thought about Marcus and the cold promise in his eyes. She thought about Adrian stepping between her and danger without hesitation, and she thought about red ribbons and warnings and the thin line between protection and possession. Outside, Chicago slept under its blanket of snow, and somewhere in that vast, cold city, Adrian Cole was likely awake too, thinking about a waitress who dared to warn him. Two people on opposite sides of a line they'd drawn together. But lines, Grace was learning, had a way of blurring in the dark. Winter had settled over Chicago with the weight of inevitability, the kind of cold that didn't just chill your skin but seeped into your bones, making you forget what warmth felt like. Grace stood outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air, trying to find the courage to go back inside. The doctors had been clear during this morning's meeting. Tyler's condition was deteriorating faster than anticipated. The treatment they'd recommended, the one the insurance company had denied, wasn't just important anymore. It was critical. Miss Miller? Dr. Reeves had said, her kind eyes full of sympathy Grace didn't want. I know this is difficult to hear, but we're running out of time. Without the treatment, we're looking at months, maybe weeks. With it, we could buy him years, a chance at remission. Years. The word had echoed in Grace's mind like a bell tolling. Years of Tyler finishing his degree, traveling, falling in love, living a life that consisted of more than hospital rooms and medical procedures. All for the low, low price of $75,000. Grace pulled out her phone with numb fingers and looked at her bank account. $3,000. She'd been saving every penny from her double shifts, every tip, every spare dollar. $3,000 against $75,000 needed. It was laughable, tragic, impossible. Her thumb hovered over her contacts, scrolling down to the number she'd entered 3 days ago but hadn't called. Adrian Cole. Just a name and 10 digits that represented a bridge she'd sworn not to cross. "Grace?" Tyler's voice called from behind her. She turned to see her brother being wheeled out by a nurse. Hospital policy required it, even though Tyler insisted he could walk. He looked pale against the wheelchair, dark circles under his eyes, but he was smiling, always smiling. "Ready to bust out of this joint?" he asked, his voice attempting lightness. "Born ready," Grace replied, matching his tone even as her heart shattered. The nurse helped Tyler into Grace's old Honda, a car held together by duct tape, prayer, and sheer determination. They'd gotten permission for him to spend the weekend at home, a small mercy before the next round of treatments began. Tyler was quiet during the drive, watching the city pass by with an intensity that made Grace's throat tight. He was memorizing it, she realized, storing up images of Chicago, his Chicago, in case he needed them later. "I'm not giving up," Tyler said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "You know that, right?" "I know, but I also don't want you destroying yourself trying to save me." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Promise me you won't do anything crazy." Grace kept her eyes on the road, unable to make a promise she might have to break. Define crazy. "Grace, Tyler, let's just have a good weekend, okay? Let's order terrible pizza and watch terrible movies and pretend we're normal people living normal lives." Tyler studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but this conversation isn't over." They spent Friday evening doing exactly that, eating pizza, watching action movies that made Tyler laugh at their absurdity, pretending the hospital didn't exist. But after Tyler fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in blankets and looking far too young, Grace sat at her kitchen table and stared at Adrian's number. Marge's words echoed in her mind. Lines are easy to draw, but once you cross them, you can't uncross them. She thought about what accepting Adrian's help would mean. The debt, not financial but something deeper. The connection to a world she'd spent her whole life avoiding. The moral compromise of taking money that came from sources she didn't want to think about. But then she looked at Tyler, at his sleeping face, and thought about Dr. Reeves's words. Months, maybe weeks. Grace picked up her phone and typed out a message before she could change her mind. "I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" The response came within seconds. "Grant Park, the Buckingham Fountain. 1 hour. I'll be there." Grant Park at night in December was a study in contrasts. The skeletal trees black against the snow, the fountain's water turned off for winter, the distant lights of the city creating a halo of warmth that didn't quite reach the frozen ground. Grace arrived early, her coat pulled tight against the wind coming off the lake. She'd told herself a dozen times during the cab ride that she could still turn back, still change her mind, still preserve the line she'd drawn, but she knew she wouldn't. Adrian was already there, standing near the fountain, his silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. He wore a long black coat and leather gloves, and when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression was carefully neutral. "Miss Miller," he said softly, "thank you for coming." "You knew I would call eventually," Grace said. "It wasn't a question. I hoped you wouldn't have to." Adrian gestured to a nearby bench, sheltered slightly from the wind. "Shall we sit?" They settled onto the cold metal, an appropriate distance between them, close enough to talk, far enough to maintain the illusion of boundaries. "Tyler's condition has gotten worse," Grace said, deciding that directness was the only way through this. "The treatment he needs costs $75,000. I have $3,000. Even if I work every hour of every day for the next year, I won't earn enough in time." Adrian listened without interruption, his eyes on the frozen fountain. "So I'm here to ask." Grace's voice caught, and she forced herself to continue. "I'm here to ask for your help, and to ask what it will cost me." "Nothing," Adrian said immediately. "That's not how the world works. It's how my world works. With you." Adrian turned to face her fully, his expression intense. "Grace. May I call you Grace?" She nodded, something shifting in her chest at hearing her name from his lips. "Grace, I told you before. No strings. No expectations. No debts. I meant it." "Why?" The word came out almost angry. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. People don't just give away that kind of money." "People in my position rarely give away anything," Adrian agreed. But you're not asking for a yacht or a vacation home or any of the ridiculous things people usually want. You're asking to save your brother. That's not greed, that's love. And love, his voice softened. Love is something I understand the value of. I don't understand. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight Grace hadn't heard before. I had a sister, Claire. She was younger than me by 8 years. Brilliant, funny, kind. Everything good that our family wasn't. Grace noticed his use of past tense and felt her stomach drop. She got sick when she was 16. Adrian continued, his eyes distant now, seeing something Grace couldn't. Similar situation to Tyler. Treatable but expensive. Experimental procedures not covered by insurance. My father was, let's say he had the money but not the inclination. He saw weakness as something to be eliminated, not accommodated. Adrian, I tried to get the money myself. I was 21, working my way up in the family business, learning all the wrong lessons about power and control, but I was too slow, too inexperienced. By the time I had enough to pay for her treatment, he stopped, his jaw working. She was gone. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in spring. I was stuck in a meeting I couldn't leave, making deals that seemed important at the time but meant nothing. Nothing. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I'm so sorry. Claire was 17 years old. She liked poetry and terrible pop music. She wanted to be a teacher. She would have been extraordinary. Adrian's voice was steady, but Grace could hear the fractures beneath it. I couldn't save her, but I can save Tyler. So please let me do this one thing. Let me turn all this money, all this power I've accumulated. Let me use it for something that actually matters. The wind whistled through the park, carrying the scent of snow and lake water. Grace sat with his words, understanding now why he'd come to the diner that first night, why he'd kept coming back, why he'd left that $500. He wasn't trying to buy her. He was trying to buy redemption. If I accept, Grace said slowly, it can't come from anything illegal. I know you probably think that's naive or impossible, but I need to know the money is clean. It will be, Adrian promised. I have legitimate businesses, nightclubs, restaurants, properties. The money will come from those sources. Legal, traceable, clean. And you're sure there are no strings? No expectations? The only expectation I have is that you'll use it to save your brother, and that afterward, you'll continue to live your life exactly as you choose to live it. If that means never speaking to me again, so be it. Grace searched his face for deception, for hidden motives, for any sign that this was too good to be true, but all she saw was sincerity, and grief, and a desperate need to make right what had once gone so terribly wrong. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I accept your help. Adrian's relief was visible. Thank you. No, Grace said, reaching out to touch his gloved hand. Thank you. You're saving Tyler's life. I don't know how I'll ever. You already have, Adrian interrupted gently. That ribbon, that warning. You saw what I was and still treated me like a human being. You have no idea what that meant to me, what it still means. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow begin to fall again, gentle flakes that caught the light from distant street lamps. Can I show you something? Adrian asked suddenly. It's not far from here. Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding. They took Adrian's car, a sleek black sedan that was probably worth more than Grace's entire life savings, and drove north through the snowy streets. Adrian drove carefully, attentive to the weather conditions, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing brief stories about the city. I grew up here, he said as they passed through an upscale neighborhood. Not in this area, obviously. We lived on the west side in a house that was too big and too cold, filled with people who smiled for cameras and schemed in private. Your family, Grace prompted carefully. My family, Adrian confirmed with a bitter smile. The Coles. We've been in Chicago for 3 generations, building an empire on secrets and silence. I was groomed from birth to take over, to continue the legacy. It never occurred to anyone that I might want something different. Did you? Want something different? I don't know. By the time I was old enough to ask that question, I was already too deep into the life to imagine another one. He glanced at her. Does that make sense? More than you'd think, Grace said softly. I never intended to spend my life working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water. I wanted to be a writer, wanted to travel, to see the world beyond Chicago. But then my parents passed and Tyler got sick, and suddenly my life wasn't about dreams anymore, it was about survival. What would you write about if you could? Grace smiled. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. About courage that doesn't look like courage. about finding hope in impossible places. I'd read that book, Adrian said seriously. They pulled into a cemetery, Graceland, one of Chicago's oldest. The gates were closed, but Adrian had a key, which didn't surprise Grace at this point. They walked through the snowy paths, past elaborate monuments and simple headstones, until Adrian stopped in front of a grave marked with a beautiful marble stone. Claire Elizabeth Cole, Grace read aloud. Beloved daughter and sister. She was a poem this world was too rushed to read. She would have hated the pretentious quote, Adrian said with a sad smile, but I picked it anyway. It felt true. It's beautiful. Adrian knelt in the snow, brushing away the flakes that had accumulated on the stone. I come here when I need to remember why I'm trying to be better than I am. When the business gets too complicated, when the lines get too blurred, when I start forgetting that there's a cost to the power I have. Grace knelt beside him, feeling the cold seep through her jeans. Tell me about her. Not the sad parts, the good parts. Adrian's face transformed. She could play piano by ear. Just listen to a song once and reproduce it perfectly. She'd spend hours playing these elaborate pieces, losing herself completely in the music. He laughed softly. And she was terrible at math, absolutely hopeless. I'd help her with her homework, and she'd get so frustrated she'd throw her pencil across the room. Then she'd apologize to the pencil. Grace found herself laughing too. She sounds wonderful. She was. Adrian's voice was thick with emotion. She made everyone around her better just by existing. She had this way of seeing the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Especially when they didn't deserve it. She saw the best in you. Always. Even when I was becoming something she would have hated, she still believed I could be more. Adrian stood, offering his hand to help Grace up. I think that's why your ribbon affected me so much. It reminded me of Claire, of the way she'd challenge me, warn me, but never give up on me. They stood in the quiet cemetery, surrounded by the evidence of ended lives and the memories they left behind. I won't waste this chance you're giving me, Grace said firmly. Tyler will live. He'll finish his degree, chase his dreams, do all the things Claire didn't get to do. I promise you that. I know, Adrian said. That's why I'm helping. They returned to the car in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Warmer, more connected. Adrian drove Grace back toward her neighborhood, the city passing by in a blur of lights and shadows. The money will be in your account by Monday morning, Adrian said as they neared her apartment. A cashier's check from one of my legitimate holdings. Everything documented, everything legal. Thank you, Grace said inadequately. There's one more thing. Adrian pulled over to the curb but kept the engine running. The men who came to the diner, Marcus and his associate, they work for people who don't like me operating in their territory. Things might get complicated in the coming weeks. Grace felt ice slide down her spine. Complicated how? Nothing that should affect you directly, but I wanted you to be aware. If anything unusual happens, if anyone approaches you asking questions about me, call me immediately. Questions like what? Anything. My schedule, my habits, who I associate with. The people I'm dealing with right now aren't above using innocent connections to gather intelligence. I'm not your connection, Grace protested weakly. Adrian smiled sadly. Aren't you? Grace, I've spent the last 3 weeks coming to your diner. I've made it obvious that He stopped, reconsidering his words. That you're someone I respect. In my world, that makes you a connection, and potentially a target. Fear and anger warred in Grace's chest. So, by helping Tyler, I'm putting myself in danger? No. By knowing me, you've already been put in a position that requires awareness. The money for Tyler is separate. That happens regardless. Adrian's expression was intense. But I need you to be careful. Be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts. And if anything feels wrong, call me. This is insane, Grace said, running her hands through her hair. This whole situation is insane. I know. And I'm sorry. If I could change what I am, the life I lead. Can't you? Grace interrupted. Can't you just walk away? Choose something different? Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it. It's not that simple. People in my position don't retire. We either die or we transition into something else, but there's always a cost. Always a price. What if you paid it, Grace? No, I'm serious. What if you paid whatever price is required and walked away? Started over. Became something other than this? Adrian looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. You make it sound easy. I make it sound possible. There's a difference. Grace reached out and took his hand. Still gloved, but warm. You helped Claire by helping Tyler. That's redemption. That's proof you're more than your worst choices. But if you stop there, if you don't keep choosing to be better, then it's just a gesture, a moment, not a transformation. You're asking me to believe I can change. I'm telling you that you can, if you want to badly enough. They sat in the car, hands clasped, the engine humming, the snow falling outside like a curtain separating them from the rest of the world. I'll think about it, Adrian said finally, about what walking away might look like, about whether it's possible. That's all I'm asking. Adrian raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently through his glove. You're extraordinary, Grace Miller. I hope you know that. Grace felt heat flood her face. I'm just a waitress trying to save her brother. No, Adrian said seriously. You're a woman who sees someone everyone else has given up on and still believes they can be better. That takes a special kind of courage. Grace left the car in a daze, her hand tingling where he'd kissed it, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. She climbed the stairs to her apartment and found Tyler still asleep on the couch, peaceful and unaware of the deal that had just been struck for his life. She sat on the floor beside him, watching him breathe, and thought about Adrian's sister, about Claire, who had believed in her brother even when he was becoming something she would have hated, about the power of that belief, and whether it was enough to actually change someone. Monday morning came with sharp winter sunshine. Grace checked her bank account with shaking hands and saw the deposit, $75,000 with a notation, investment payment, Cole Entertainment Holdings LLC. Clean money, legal money, life-saving money. She called the hospital immediately and scheduled Tyler's treatment. Dr. Reeves's relief was audible through the phone. We can start this week, the doctor said. Miss Miller, I know this must have been incredibly difficult to arrange, but you're giving your brother a real chance. You're giving him hope. Grace hung up and cried. Tears of relief, gratitude, and a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't quite name. That evening at the diner, Grace told Marge everything. Well, almost everything. She explained about the money, about Adrian's sister, about the legitimate source of the funds. But she didn't mention the cemetery visit, or the hand-holding, or the way her heart had felt when Adrian looked at her like she was something precious. So you crossed the line, Marge said when Grace finished. To save Tyler. Yes. And now? Now Tyler gets his treatment and I... Grace paused. I don't know. Adrian said there are no expectations, that I can choose to never see him again. But you don't want that, Marge observed. No, Grace admitted quietly. I don't. And I don't know what that says about me. It says you're human, that you're capable of seeing complexity in people others have written off. Marge squeezed her hand. Just be careful, honey. Men like Adrian Cole, they can change, but change is hard and messy, and sometimes they slip back into old patterns. You can't save him the way you saved Tyler. He has to save himself. Before Grace could respond, Jenny, a waitress who worked the morning shift, appeared at the counter. She looked nervous, twisting her apron in her hands. Grace, can I talk to you for a second? Sure. What's up? Jenny glanced at Marge, then back to Grace. It's about that man, the one who's been coming in, Adrian Cole. Grace felt her stomach tighten. What about him? My cousin dated a guy who worked for someone like him, someone in that business. It started out okay. He had money, he was charming, he treated her well. But then things got complicated. His world started creeping into hers. People asking questions, following her, trying to use her to get to him. Jenny's eyes were worried. She had to move out of state to get away from it all. Jenny, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not telling you what to do, Jenny interrupted. I'm just saying, be careful. These men, they can't help bringing their problems with them. No matter how much they care about you, the danger follows them like a shadow. After Jenny left, Grace stood at the counter thinking about shadows and dangers, and the price of connection. She thought about Marcus, about the veiled threats in the diner, about Adrian's warning to be aware of her surroundings. She thought about lines drawn and then crossed and whether it was possible to cross back. The evening shift was busy, a welcome distraction. Grace lost herself in the rhythm of work, in the simple pleasure of serving people who just wanted a meal and some warmth on a cold night. Around 8 o'clock, her phone buzzed. A text from Adrian. How's Tyler? Grace smiled and typed back. Treatment starts Wednesday. Doctor is optimistic. Good. That's good. She hesitated, then added, thank you. For everything. The response came quickly. Thank you for letting me help. For giving meaning to resources that otherwise would be wasted on meaningless things. Grace was about to put her phone away when another message appeared. I've been thinking about what you said, about paying the price to walk away. I have some calls to make, some arrangements to consider. It won't be easy, but you're right. If I don't try, then helping Tyler was just a gesture, not a transformation. Grace's heart skipped. She typed, "That's all anyone can ask. To try. I have to go out of town for a few days. Business that can't be avoided. But I'll be thinking about what's possible, about what kind of man I could be, if I had the courage. You have the courage, you just need to use it. Your faith in me is either inspiring or dangerous. Possibly both." Grace laughed and wrote back, "Definitely both." There was a pause, then, "Be safe, Grace. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, call me. I'll answer. Always." The message ended there, but Grace stared at her phone for a long time, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. She thought about transformation and redemption, about belief and danger, about a man who carried grief like armor and showed her his softest parts in a frozen cemetery. She thought about how, somewhere along the way, Adrian Cole had stopped being a warning and started being a possibility, and that, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. Outside, the Chicago night was cold and clear, full of stars that struggled to shine through the city's lights. Somewhere in that vast urban sprawl, Adrian was making calls, considering arrangements, contemplating a future that looked different from his past. And Grace stood in the warm glow of the diner, holding on to hope like a red ribbon tied around steel, a warning that had somehow transformed into a promise. The line between them was still there, but now they were both standing on it, leaning toward each other across the divide, wondering if courage and faith and the desire to be better could build a bridge strong enough to hold them both. Time would tell. And winter, despite its cold, was the season of quiet transformations, of things that looked frozen, but were actually just waiting for the right moment to bloom. 3 weeks after Tyler's treatment began, Grace was closing the diner alone when 2 men entered. Not Marcus this time. Strangers with cold eyes and calculated smiles. "Grace Miller," the taller one said. "Not a question. We need information about Adrian Cole." Grace's hand moved toward her phone. "I don't know what you're talking about. His schedule, his properties, his vulnerabilities." The man stepped closer. "You've been seen with him. You matter to him. That makes you useful." "I'm a waitress. He's a customer, that's all." "That's not what our sources say." The second man blocked the door. "We can do this the easy way, or—" Grace's phone was already dialing. Adrian answered on the first ring. "Grace? There are men here," she said, keeping her voice steady. "They're asking about you. Put them on speaker." She did. Adrian's voice filled the diner, controlled and dangerous. "Gentlemen, you have 10 seconds to leave that establishment before I make your organization's existence extremely complicated. Cole, you don't have the leverage. 9 seconds. I have federal agents on speed dial who would love to discuss your employer's tax irregularities. 8 seconds. I have documentation of offshore accounts. 7 seconds. The men exchanged glances. The threat wasn't physical. It was legal, financial, strategic, more dangerous than any confrontation. They left without another word. Grace's hands shook as she locked the door behind them. Her phone rang again. "Adrian, are you hurt?" "No. Scared, but not hurt." "I'm so sorry." His voice cracked. "This is my fault. My world touching yours. Exactly what you warned me about." "Adrian, I'm done, Grace. I'm walking away. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I'm getting out. You were right. Helping Tyler was just a gesture unless I actually change." He paused. "I'm meeting with federal prosecutors tomorrow. I'm cooperating fully, dismantling everything. It means prison time, reduced but real. 18 months minimum." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. "You're serious. You made me believe I could be better. Now I have to prove it." His voice softened. "When I get out, if you still want to know me, the real me, not this version, maybe we could start over. No secrets, no shadows. I'll be here," Grace whispered. "That's all I need to hear." The line went dead. Grace stood in the empty diner holding her phone, understanding that Adrian had just chosen the hardest path possible. For her, for himself, for the man he wanted to become. Redemption, she realized, always comes with a price, and he was finally willing to pay it. 18 months is long enough for a city to change its face. Buildings rise and fall, businesses open and close, people arrive and depart like tides against Chicago's shores. But some things, the important things, remain constant. The lake still crashes against the rocks. The wind still cuts through the streets in winter. And hope, if tended carefully, still finds ways to grow. Grace Miller stood behind the counter of her bakery, Miller's, watching the early spring rain streak down the front windows. The space was small, just 12 tables, a display case, and a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, but it was hers. Every tile, every chair, every carefully chosen detail represented a dream she'd stopped believing in until Adrian Cole had reminded her that dreams were still possible. The bakery had opened 6 months ago, funded partially by money Adrian had left in a legal trust before his sentencing. For your future, the lawyer had explained. Mr. Cole was very specific that this was separate from Tyler's medical expenses. He said something about you wanting to be a writer, and that stories deserve a place to be born. Grace had cried reading the letter that accompanied the trust. Adrian's handwriting, familiar now from the letters they'd exchanged during his incarceration, spelled out his hopes for her. Build something beautiful. Create a space where people feel safe. And if you still want to know me when I'm free, I'll come find you there. She'd done exactly that. The bakery served coffee and pastries during the day, but in the evenings, Grace hosted a writing group. Aspiring authors gathering around tables, sharing stories, encouraging each other's dreams. It was everything she'd wanted, wrapped in flour and hope and the smell of fresh bread. The bell above the door chimed. Grace looked up from the croissants she was arranging and smiled. Tyler, you're early. Her brother entered, shaking rain from his jacket, looking nothing like the pale, exhausted young man from 18 months ago. Tyler had gained back the weight he'd lost. His color was healthy, and most importantly, his eyes were bright with life. The treatment had worked. The remission was holding. Dr. Reeves called him her miracle patient, but Grace knew it wasn't a miracle. It was Adrian Cole's grief transformed into purpose. Finished my exam early, Tyler said, pouring himself coffee from the station Grace kept for regulars. Aced it naturally. Naturally, Grace echoed with pride. Tyler was back in school, finishing his degree in education. He wanted to teach science to middle schoolers, to inspire the next generation the way his own teachers had inspired him. So, Tyler said, settling into a chair near the counter. Today's the day, right? Grace's hands stilled on the croissants. I don't know what you're talking about. Grace, come on. He gets out today. You've been checking your phone every 5 minutes for the past week. She had. Grace had memorized Adrian's release date the way some people memorized birthdays or anniversaries. April 15th. Today. Right now, he was probably walking out of the minimum security facility downstate, stepping into spring sunshine as a free man. He might not come, Grace said quietly. It's been 18 months. People change. Maybe he's changed his mind about... She gestured vaguely at herself, at the bakery, at everything. The guy who wrote you a letter every single week for 18 months. Who called you every Sunday when he had phone privileges. Who set up a trust fund for your bakery before he even knew if you'd forgive him. Tyler raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I'm sure he's totally changed his mind. Grace laughed despite her nerves. When did you get so wise? Around the time I almost lost everything and realized what actually matters. Tyler reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. He's coming, Grace. And when he does, you're going to be terrified and hopeful and probably want to run away. But don't. Because what you two have, whatever this weird, complicated thing is, it's real. And real is worth fighting for. The morning passed in a blur of customers and baking. Grace made coffee, sold pastries, chatted with regulars, and tried not to watch the door every 30 seconds. She failed spectacularly. Around 2 o'clock, the lunch rush died down, leaving the bakery peaceful and quiet. Grace was wiping down tables when the bell chimed again. She knew before she turned around, felt it in the air, in the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat, in the way time seemed to slow and sharpen all at once. Adrian Cole stood in the doorway of her bakery, and he was different. Not in obvious ways. He was still tall, still carried himself with that controlled grace, still had those storm cloud eyes that saw too much. But something fundamental had shifted. The hardness was gone, replaced by something softer, more open, more human. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a blue button-down, a jacket that had seen better days. No expensive suit, no Italian leather shoes. He looked like a man who'd learned to be comfortable with less, with humility. Hi, Adrian said, and even his voice was different, less controlled, more genuine. Hi, Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there, separated by 15 feet and 18 months of transformation, just looking at each other. The bakery is beautiful, Adrian said finally, his eyes scanning the space. Exactly how I imagined it. Better, actually. Thank you. For, Grace gestured at everything. For making it possible. You made it possible. I just provided resources. Adrian took a tentative step forward. Is it okay if I come in? As a customer? Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his careful courtesy, his refusal to assume anything. Yes, please. Sit wherever you like. Adrian chose a table near the window, not the corner where he could watch the exits, she noticed, but right in the open. Another change. Another sign that he was trying to live differently. Grace approached with her order pad, playing along with the pretense of normalcy, even though her hands were shaking. What can I get you? Coffee, black, and... Adrian looked at the display case. What do you recommend? The almond croissant, it's my grandmother's recipe. Perfect. I'll have that. Grace prepared his order, acutely aware of his eyes following her movements. When she set the plate and cup in front of him, she noticed something that made her breath catch. On the fork beside his croissant, tied carefully around the handle, was a small red ribbon. Adrian saw it at the same moment. He looked up at her, and the expression on his face, surprise, joy, understanding, made her heart ache. Still warning me? He asked softly, echoing the words from so long ago. Grace slid into the seat across from him, abandoning all pretense. No. Reminding you what you chose to become. Adrian picked up the fork, examining the ribbon with the same careful attention he'd given it 18 months ago in a diner that seemed like a lifetime away. I kept the original one, the ribbon from that first night. I had it with me the whole time. A reminder of the moment someone saw what I was and still believed I could be better. You are better, Grace said firmly. You paid your debt. You cooperated fully. I read the news. The prosecutor said your testimony helped dismantle 3 major criminal operations. And put me in prison for 18 months, Adrian added. Don't romanticize it, Grace. I made choices, terrible choices, that hurt people. Prison was justice, not heroism. I know, but you chose it anyway, that's what matters. Adrian set down the fork and reached across the table, his hand palm up, an invitation. Grace placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that hadn't been there before, evidence of honest work, of transformation earned through labor. I have a job, Adrian said. Nothing glamorous. I'm managing a community center in Englewood, the same one I helped fund years ago back when I thought money could erase guilt. Turns out working there, being present, actually helping people, that's what matters. Not the money. The presence. That sounds perfect. I'm in therapy, twice a week, dealing with the grief about Claire, the guilt about my past, learning how to be a person who doesn't solve problems through intimidation or control. How's that going? Adrian smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. It's hard, really hard. Some days I want to fall back into old patterns because they're familiar and easy, but then I remember what falling back would cost me. What's that? This. He gestured between them. The possibility of something real with someone who makes me want to be worthy of their faith. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. Adrian, I'm not asking for promises, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking you to forget the past 18 months, or pretend the danger didn't happen. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to try, to get to know each other properly this time. No secrets, no shadows, just 2 people seeing if what they felt in the darkness can survive in the light. Grace thought about red ribbons and warnings, about lines drawn and crossed, about the price of redemption and the weight of hope. She thought about Tyler, healthy and whole, living a life that Adrian's grief had made possible. She thought about letters written from prison, phone calls filled with honest vulnerability, a man who'd dismantled his entire world because she'd believed he could be better. I'd like that, she whispered, to try, to see what we could build together. Adrian's relief was palpable. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. The same gesture from 18 months ago, but different now. Earned instead of stolen. Honest instead of complicated. They talked for hours. About his time inside. About the men he'd met and the lessons he'd learned. About Grace's bakery. About Tyler's recovery. About the writing group and the community she was building. About their fears and hopes. About the future they might create if they were brave enough. As the afternoon faded into evening, Tyler stopped by. He'd been circling the block, he admitted sheepishly, wanting to give them space but also unable to resist checking in. You must be Adrian, Tyler said, extending his hand. Adrian stood, shaking it firmly. Tyler, I'm glad to finally meet you properly. You look well. Thanks to you, Tyler said simply. Grace told me everything. What you did for me, for her. I don't know how to— You don't need to thank me, Adrian interrupted. Being here, being healthy, living your life, that's thanks enough, that's everything. The three of them sat together as the bakery's windows darkened, talking and laughing, building something fragile and new. Grace watched Adrian interact with her brother, gentle, interested, genuine, and saw the man he was becoming. Not perfect, not without scars, but trying, growing, transforming. As Tyler prepared to leave, he hugged Grace tight. He's good for you, he whispered in her ear. Different from who he was. You were right to believe in him. After Tyler left, Grace and Adrian stood together at the bakery's front window, watching the Chicago night come alive with lights. I should go, Adrian said reluctantly. You probably need to close up and I don't want to overstay. Stay, Grace interrupted. Help me close. Then maybe we could walk. There's a park nearby. We could just talk more, if you want. I want, Adrian said immediately. I want very much. They cleaned the bakery together, falling into an easy rhythm. Grace washing dishes while Adrian dried, both of them stealing glances and smiling when they were caught. It felt domestic, normal, like a glimpse of what their future might hold if they were patient and brave. As they stepped out into the spring night, the air was cool but no longer cold. Winter had finally released its grip on Chicago, making way for renewal and growth. Grace locked the door and turned to find Adrian offering his arm. She took it, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, and they walked toward the park together. Thank you, Adrian said as they walked. For the ribbon, for remembering. I never forgot, Grace admitted. That first night when you smiled at the warning, I knew then that you were different from what I expected. More complicated, more human. And now, am I what you expected? Grace looked up at him, at this man who'd paid the price for transformation, who'd chosen the hardest path because she'd believed he could, and smiled. No, she said honestly. You're better. You're real. You're someone who kept every promise even when it cost everything. Adrian stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the dim light of the street lamps, his eyes held that same intensity from 18 months ago, but warmer now, less guarded. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your faith, he said quietly. I can't promise perfection. I can't promise it will always be easy, but I can promise I'll never stop trying to be the man you believed I could be. That's all I'm asking, Grace said. Just keep trying, keep choosing to be better, that's enough. They stood there in the Chicago night, a waitress who'd become a baker and a criminal who'd become something gentler, and the space between them felt full of possibility. The red ribbon had been a warning once, then a reminder. Now it was something else entirely, a symbol of transformation, of faith rewarded, of two people who'd drawn lines in the darkness and then bravely chose to cross them together. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real, complicated, earned through sacrifice and honesty and the courage to believe that people could change. And as they walked into their uncertain future, hand in hand, the only promise between them was this: to try, to be honest, to build something real from the ashes of who they used to be. Sometimes that's all redemption is, the willingness to try, day after day, to be better than yesterday. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone believes in you enough to make the trying worthwhile.